It was a scorching afternoon in downtown Atlanta, the kind of day where the sun seemed to press down on the city with an unrelenting intensity. The air shimmered above the pavement, and even the slightest breeze felt like a blessing. Officer Mark Jenkins, a seasoned but somewhat jaded member of the local police force, pulled his patrol car to a screeching halt near the courthouse. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the bustling street, though his eyes were trained on a woman who had just exited a sleek black car. She was impeccably dressed, a tailored blazer and matching skirt exuding professionalism. A leather briefcase swung at her side as she walked briskly toward the courthouse steps. Jenkins couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about her caught his attention. Perhaps it was the confidence in her stride, or maybe it was simply that she stood out among the usual crowd. "Doesn't belong," Jenkins muttered under his breath, adjusting his sunglasses. He didn't know why he thought that, but the notion stuck. With a practiced motion, he stepped out of his car, his boots clicking against the pavement. "Man," he called out, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby pedestrians. The woman paused mid-step, turning toward him with a composed expression. Her brow arched slightly in what appeared to be mild confusion, but there was no fear in her eyes. "Yes, officer?" she asked, standing tall and meeting his gaze directly. Jenkins folded his arms, his tone firm, but laced with an air of authority. "Do you know this is a restricted parking zone?" He gestured toward her car, as though the offense was glaringly obvious. The woman glanced back at her vehicle, then returned her focus to Jenkins. "I'm here for a court meeting," she replied evenly. "I won't be long." Her calm demeanor seemed to irritate Jenkins. He smirked, taking a step closer. "A court meeting, huh? Got some ID to prove that?" He nodded toward her briefcase. "And maybe pop that open while they were at it." The woman blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the request. "I'm not sure why you'd need to see inside my briefcase," she said, her voice firm but measured. "I'm not under suspicion, and this interaction doesn't seem warranted." Jenkins tilted his head, a condescending grin creeping across his face. "Look, Mom, you've got two choices. You comply, or we take this downtown. Your call." A few pedestrians slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding exchange. The woman sighed, reaching into her pocket and producing her ID. She handed it over without a word, though her gaze never wavered. Jenkins barely glanced at it before pressing again. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. Her patience seemed to thin as she took a step back. "I'm not opening my briefcase for you, officer," she said, her tone sharp now. "If you'll excuse me, I'm already late." But Jenkins wasn't ready to let her go. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Late for what exactly? Some shady business deal. A phone buzzed in her hand, and she answered without hesitation. "Hello, Chief Hendrick," she said into the receiver, her voice carrying a calm authority. "This is Judge Olivia Moore. I'm standing outside the courthouse, being detained for no apparent reason by an officer named Jenkins. Could you send someone down?" The words hit Jenkins like a ton of bricks. Judge Olivia Moore. His mind raced, trying to piece together what he had just heard, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He crossed his arms, scoffing. "A judge? That's a new one," he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Got any other stories you want to tell?" Moments later, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and out stepped Chief Hendrick himself, his crisp uniform commanding attention. The gathered crowd began to murmur, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Hendrick's face was unreadable as he approached, his gaze shifting between Jenkins and Judge Moore. "Officer Jenkins," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" Jenkins straightened up, his confidence faltering slightly. "Caught her parking in a restricted zone," he said defensively. "She seems suspicious, so I asked for her ID and to check her belongings. She's refusing." The chief turned to Judge Moore, his expression softening. "Your Honor, I'm so sorry for this. Are you all right?" Judge Moore adjusted her blazer, her posture unwavering. I'm fine, she replied. But this behavior is unacceptable. Officer Jenkins escalated a situation without cause. Hendrick's eyes narrowed as he turned back to Jenkins. Judge Olivia Moore, he said slowly, as though emphasizing every syllable. Our state's newest federal appointee, the same person you've been harassing for the past 10 minutes. Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The crowd, which had grown larger by now, exchanged glances and whispered among themselves. This department has no room for such conduct, Hendrick said firmly. Officer Jenkins, consider yourself suspended pending an investigation. Hand over your badge and weapon. The onlookers gasped as Jenkins reluctantly obeyed, his face ashen. Judge Moore gave the chief a curt nod before turning and walking up the courthouse steps, her dignity intact. Behind her, Jenkins was led away by another officer, his career hanging by a thread. The crowd began to disperse, murmurs of justice and accountability lingering in the air. But as Judge Moore disappeared into the courthouse, a question hung unspoken. What would happen next? The courthouse doors closed behind Judge Olivia Moore with a heavy finality, muffling the murmurs of the curious crowd outside. She allowed herself a brief moment to exhale, her composure never faltering, but the weight of the encounter lingering. The air-conditioned interior was a welcome reprieve from the sweltering heat, but her mind remained focused, replaying the events that had unfolded on the courthouse steps. Her phone buzzed in her hand again, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from her assistant Lisa. Asterisk everything set for the meeting. Need coffee? Asterisk Olivia smiled faintly, appreciating the levity in the midst of a chaotic morning. She typed a quick reply, asterisk already on it. See you in 5. Asterisk. As she strode toward the elevators, her heels clicking against the marble floors, Olivia's mind began to piece together the implications of what had just happened. It wasn't just an isolated incident of one officer overstepping his bounds. No, this was a symptom of a deeper issue, an ingrained culture that allowed such behaviors to persist unchecked. She had seen it before, during her time as a defense attorney and later as a judge. But today's experience was personal. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Officer Mark Jenkins sat on the curb, his badge and gun now in the custody of another officer. His hands rested on his knees, but his mind was spinning. The humiliation was bad enough, the stares, the whispers. But it was the gnawing realization that he might have ruined his career that made his stomach churn. Chief Hendrick stood a few feet away, speaking with one of the senior officers in hushed tones. Every so often, his eyes flicked toward Jenkins, his expression unreadable. Jenkins couldn't hear what was being said, but he didn't need to. He could feel the judgment hanging heavy in the air. Mark, a voice said, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see his partner, Officer Lisa Hart, standing over him. Her expression was a mix of concern and frustration. Lisa, Jenkins muttered, his voice low. What were you thinking? She asked, crouching down to his level. Do you have any idea who that was? Jenkins shook his head, his jaw tightening. I didn't know, he said defensively. She didn't look like. Like what? Lisa cut him off, her tone sharp. Like someone important. Someone who deserves basic respect. Mark, do you even hear yourself? He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Lisa sighed, standing back up and crossing her arms. This isn't just about you, she said. It's about the department, the community. Every mistake like this sets us back years. You've got to own up to it. Inside the courthouse, Olivia entered a small conference room, where Lisa, her assistant, had already laid out files and documents for the meeting. The room was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning, and Olivia took a moment to center herself. Rough morning? Lisa asked, glancing up from her notes. You could say that, Olivia replied, sitting down and flipping open a folder. Lisa hesitated before speaking again. I heard about what happened outside. Word spreads fast around here. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. It's being handled, she said simply, though the fire in her eyes suggested she wasn't about to let the matter rest. Let's focus on the agenda for now. The meeting proceeded smoothly, but the earlier incident lingered in the back of Olivia's mind. She couldn't shake the image of Officer Jenkins' condescending smirk, the way he had so casually dismissed her authority. It wasn't just about her, it was about what she represented. By the time the meeting concluded, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. Olivia gathered her things, preparing to leave for the day. As she walked back through the courthouse lobby, she noticed Chief Hendrik waiting near the entrance. "Your Honor," he said, tipping his hat slightly as she approached. "May I have a word?" Olivia nodded, adjusting the strap of her briefcase. "Of course, Chief." The two stepped aside, finding a quiet corner away from the flow of people coming and going. Hendrik's expression was serious, his voice low. "I want to personally apologize for what happened this morning," he said. "It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the conduct of my officers." "I appreciate that," Olivia replied, her tone measured. "But apologies only go so far. What happened today wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of a systemic problem." Hendrik nodded slowly. "I agree, and I'm committed to addressing it. Officer Jenkins has been suspended pending an investigation, but I'd like to go beyond that. We need training, accountability, a shift in culture. And I'd welcome your input on how to make that happen." Olivia studied him for a moment, weighing his sincerity. She could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of trying to navigate a system that often resisted change. "If you're serious about this," she said finally, "then I'll help. But it's going to take more than a few workshops and memos." "Understood," Hendrik said, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you, Your Honor." As Olivia walked to her car, the heat of the day lingering in the air, she felt a sense of resolve. The encounter with Jenkins was just one chapter in a much larger story, and she was determined to play her part in rewriting it. Back at the precinct, Jenkins sat in the locker room, staring at the empty space where his badge and gun had once been. He could hear the faint murmur of voices outside. Officers discussing the day's events, his name undoubtedly part of the conversation. Lisa entered, closing the door behind her. She leaned against the lockers, arms crossed. "You've got a choice to make, Mark," she said. "You can keep making excuses, or you can start figuring out how to fix this." Jenkins didn't respond at first, his gaze fixed on the floor. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you come back from something like this?" Lisa sighed. "By owning it, by doing better. It's not going to be easy, but if you care about this job, about making things right, you'll find a way." As the day turned to night, the city buzzed with the sounds of life continuing on. But for Olivia, Jenkins, and Hendrik, the events of that sweltering afternoon were far from over. Each of them stood at a crossroads, the choices they made in the coming days set to shape not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. The night brought a quiet stillness to the city, but for Judge Olivia Moore, it was no such peace. She sat in her home office, the dim light of a desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Her laptop screen glowed with the details of her upcoming cases, but her focus was elsewhere. The morning's confrontation replayed in her mind like a broken record, each moment sharpening her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had experienced the same kind of treatment, those who didn't have her platform, her authority, her voice. Olivia knew she had a responsibility not just to herself, but to every person who had been silenced or dismissed by a system meant to protect them. Across town, Mark Jenkins sat alone in a small, dimly lit bar. His suspension was sinking in, the weight of it pressing harder with each passing hour. He stared at his untouched drink, his mind swirling with regret and frustration. He didn't know how things had spiraled so quickly out of control. He had made assumptions, wrong ones, and now he was paying the price. His partner, Lisa, slid into the seat across from him. She didn't say anything at first, letting the silence linger before finally speaking. "You know this isn't just about today, right?" she said, her voice steady but firm. Jenkins frowned, looking up at her. "What's that supposed to mean?" It means this wasn't an isolated incident, Mark. You've been walking this line for a while now. The way you approach certain people, the way you assume things about them, it's not okay. And now, it's caught up to you. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered. But it did, Lisa replied. And if you don't start acknowledging why, you're going to lose everything. Not just your badge, but your credibility, your respect. Is that what you want? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at his drink, the reality of her words settling in like a heavy weight. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the courthouse early, her mind set on the day ahead. As she stepped into her chambers, she found a bouquet of flowers waiting on her desk. A small card attached read, Asterisk my deepest apologies. Chief Hendrik. Asterisk, she set the card aside, appreciating the gesture, but knowing it wouldn't be enough to fix the larger problem. Her assistant, Lisa, entered with a clipboard in hand. Your Honor, the media is already asking for comments about yesterday's incident, she said. Do you want me to prepare a statement? Olivia shook her head. Not yet. Let them speculate for now. I want to see how the department handles this before I say anything. Lisa nodded, but her expression was hesitant. Do you think they'll actually do something? Or will this just get swept under the rug like so many other cases? Olivia's gaze hardened. Not if I have anything to say about it. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Chief Hendrik called an emergency meeting with his senior officers. The room was tense, the atmosphere thick with unspoken judgment. Hendrik stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood. This department is at a crossroads, he began, his voice steady but firm. What happened yesterday wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure. A failure of judgment, a failure of training, and a failure of accountability. And it reflects on all of us. One of the officers, Captain Reynolds, leaned forward in his chair. Chief, with all due respect, Jenkins made a bad call, but do we really need to overhaul the entire department because of one incident? Hendrik's eyes narrowed. This isn't about one incident, Captain. This is about a pattern, a culture, that we've allowed to persist for far too long. If we don't address it now, we're not just failing our community, we're failing ourselves. Reynolds didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. Hendrik continued, his tone unwavering. Effective immediately, we're implementing mandatory training on implicit bias and de-escalation tactics. We're also reviewing all complaints of misconduct over the past year. No exceptions. The room erupted in murmurs, some of approval, others of frustration. Hendrik let them speak, his own resolve unshaken. Back in her chambers, Olivia received an email from a local journalist requesting an interview. She hesitated, unsure of how much she wanted to involve the media in what was still an unfolding situation. But as she read through the message, one line caught her attention. Asterisk, your story could help bring attention to a systemic issue that's been ignored for far too long. Asterisk. She closed her laptop, leaning back in her chair. The journalist wasn't wrong. She had a platform, and with it came responsibility. But speaking out would also make her a target. She wasn't afraid for herself, but she worried about the potential backlash, both for her and for those she hoped to help. As the day wore on, Jenkins found himself pacing his small apartment. He couldn't shake the memory of the way the crowd had looked at him, the whispers of judgment that followed him as he handed over his badge. He thought about Lisa's words, about the mistakes he had made, and for the first time he began to see things from a different perspective. Later that evening, Jenkins found himself outside the precinct, staring up at the building that had been his second home for years. He took a deep breath and walked inside, his steps slow but deliberate. He didn't know what he was going to say or do, but he knew he couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. The receptionist looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but curious. Officer Jenkins, she said. I thought you were on suspension. I am, he replied. But I need to talk to the chief. She hesitated for a moment before picking up the phone. I'll see if he's available. As Jenkins waited, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his decision. He didn't know if this was the first step toward redemption or the beginning of the end, but he knew he had to try. In her home office, Olivia sat at her desk, staring at the journalist's email. After a moment, she began typing a response. She didn't know where this road would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to stay silent. The precinct was unusually quiet as Officer Jenkins sat outside Chief Hendrick's office, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. Every sound, the ringing of a phone, the faint click of a keyboard, seemed amplified in the silence. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, most of them second-guessing whether he had made the right decision to come here. The door opened, and Hendrick stepped out, his face unreadable. "Jenkins," he said simply, motioning for him to enter. Jenkins stood, his heart pounding as he followed the chief into the office. Hendrick didn't sit immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, looking out at the city below. "So," he began, his tone even, "what brings you here?" Jenkins hesitated, the words caught in his throat. Finally, he took a deep breath. "I need to make things right, Chief," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves gnawing at him. Hendrick turned to face him, one brow raised. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" "I want to own up to what I did," Jenkins said. "Not just to you, but to Judge Moore. I need her to know I understand how badly I messed up. And I want to be part of fixing the problem, not adding to it." Hendrick studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That's a start," he said finally. "But words alone won't cut it. If you're serious about this, you're going to have to prove it. Not to me, but to the community, to your peers, and to Judge Moore." "I understand," Jenkins replied, his jaw tightening. But Hendrick said, "Because this isn't about saving your career, Jenkins. This is about something bigger. If you're not ready for that, you can walk out that door right now." Jenkins didn't move. "I'm ready," he said firmly. Elsewhere, Judge Moore was finishing up a call with the journalist who had reached out to her. The conversation had been cautious but productive, focusing on the broader systemic issues rather than her personal experience. Still, as she hung up the phone, a sense of unease settled over her. Speaking out was necessary, but it came with risks, especially for someone in her position. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Lisa, her assistant, holding a folder. "Your Honor," she said, stepping into the room. "You need to see this." Olivia took the folder, flipping it open. Inside were detailed reports of misconduct within the precinct, some dating back years. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. "A source in the department," Lisa replied. "They said you'd want to know what you're up against." As Olivia scanned the reports, her jaw tightened. The patterns were clear: targeted stops, excessive use of force, complaints swept under the rug. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about a culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Meanwhile, Jenkins was sitting in a small conference room with Lisa Hart, his partner. She had agreed to help him prepare for what he knew would be one of the hardest conversations of his life. "You need to be honest," Lisa said, her tone firm, but not unkind. "No excuses, no justifications. Just take responsibility and show her you're willing to change." "I know," Jenkins replied, his hands fidgeting nervously. "But what if it's not enough? What if she doesn't believe me?" "She might not," Lisa admitted. "And that's her right. But this isn't about getting her approval mark. This is about doing the right thing, no matter the outcome." The next day, Olivia was preparing to leave the courthouse when Chief Hendrick approached her in the lobby. "Your Honor," he said, his tone respectful but serious. "May I have a moment?" She nodded, adjusting the strap of her bag. "Of course." "I wanted to let you know that Officer Jenkins has requested to meet with you," Hendrick said. "He says he wants to apologize in person." Olivia's expression didn't change, but her mind raced. Part of her wanted to refuse, to let him deal with the consequences of his actions without her involvement. But another part of her knew the importance of accountability and the power of facing one's mistakes head-on. "I'll meet with him," she said finally. "But not here. I wanted to be on neutral ground. Hendrik nodded. Understood. I'll arrange it. That evening, Olivia sat in a quiet cafe, the soft hum of conversation and clinking dishes providing a soothing backdrop. Across from her, Jenkins sat with his hands clasped tightly together, his posture rigid. I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me, Jenkins began, his voice hesitant. Olivia raised a brow, her expression neutral but attentive. I'm here to listen, she said. Jenkins took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, he said, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. There's no excuse for it. I made assumptions, and I let my biases dictate my actions. I was wrong. Olivia studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. And what do you plan to do about it? She asked, her tone calm but firm. I want to learn, Jenkins replied. I want to understand the harm I've caused and be part of changing the system that allows it to happen. I know it won't be easy, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I'm willing to do the work. The cafe seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment palpable. Olivia leaned back in her chair, considering his words. She had seen apologies before, some genuine, others hollow. Time would tell where Jenkins fell, but for now she decided to leave him with a challenge. This isn't just about you, she said. If you're serious about change, it needs to go beyond your own actions. It's about the system you're a part of and the people you serve. Are you ready for that kind of responsibility? Jenkins nodded, his determination evident. I am, he said. Olivia's expression softened ever so slightly. Then let's see if your actions match your words. As they parted ways, the tension lingered, unresolved, but charged with the potential for change. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The next steps would determine not just the fate of one officer or one judge, but the integrity of a system in desperate need of reform. As Olivia left the cafe, the air outside felt heavier than usual, carrying with it a sense of unresolved tension. The conversation with Jenkins had been unexpected, not for his apology, but for the sincerity that seemed to underline it. She had heard plenty of hollow words in her career, but there was something different this time. Still, Olivia knew better than to place too much stock in one meeting. Change, if it came, would take more than a single conversation. Her thoughts were interrupted as her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Lisa, her assistant. It was short and cryptic. Asterisk, we need to talk. Something came up. Asterisk, Olivia frowned, sensing the urgency in the message. Without hesitation, she dialed Lisa's number. Your Honor, Lisa answered quickly, her voice tight. I just received an anonymous tip. It's about Officer Jenkins. Olivia felt a pang of dread. What is it? There's a complaint in his file, Lisa explained. A serious one. It never made it through proper channels, but the details are troubling. The person who reached out claimed there was pressure from within the precinct to bury it. Olivia's grip tightened on the phone. What kind of complaint? Lisa hesitated, then said, It involves a young man, a teenager. He was stopped by Jenkins a few months ago. The report alleges excessive force and an unlawful search, but the case was dismissed before it even reached internal affairs. For a moment, Olivia said nothing, her mind racing. Jenkins had spoken of accountability, of wanting to change, but if this was true, it added a new layer to the story, one she couldn't ignore. Send me everything you have, Olivia finally said, and reach out to the tipster. See if they're willing to speak on record. Will do, Lisa replied before the call ended. Back at the precinct, Jenkins was in the middle of a mandated training session when he was summoned to Chief Hendrick's office. He could feel the stares of his colleagues as he made his way down the hall, their whispered conversations a low hum that followed him. When he entered the office, Hendrick's expression was grim. Take a seat, Jenkins, the chief said, motioning to the chair opposite his desk. Jenkins sat, his stomach tightening. What's going on? Hendrick leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. I received a call this afternoon. It seems there's a complaint in your file that was never properly addressed. Jenkins blinked, his mind scrambling to remember. What complaint? Hendricks' gaze didn't waver. It's about a stop you made a few months ago. A teenage boy. There are allegations of excessive force. Jenkins' chest tightened as the memory surfaced. He remembered the stop. The kid had been acting suspicious, or at least that's what he had thought at the time. But the interaction had escalated quickly, and in hindsight, he knew he hadn't handled it well. I didn't think it would go this far, Jenkins admitted quietly. The kid didn't file a formal complaint, did he? No, Hendricks said. But someone else did. And now it's come back to haunt us. Jenkins rubbed a hand over his face. What happens now? That depends, Hendrick replied. Judge Moore has already been briefed. If this becomes public, it's not just your career on the line, it's the department's reputation. Jenkins felt the weight of the words. He had thought the hardest part was behind him, but now it seemed like the consequences of his past actions were just beginning to unravel. Meanwhile, Olivia was piecing together the information Lisa had sent her. The details of the complaint painted a troubling picture, not just of Jenkins' actions but of a system that had allowed the incident to be buried. It was a reminder of how deep the problem ran and how much work still needed to be done. But as Olivia delved deeper, a new piece of information emerged. The tipster had provided more than just details about the complaint. They had also mentioned the senior officer who had played a role in suppressing it. Captain Reynolds, one of Hendrick's most trusted lieutenants, was named as the person who had ordered the report to be dismissed. This revelation sent a chill down Olivia's spine. If true, it meant the corruption extended higher than she had anticipated. And it raised a new question. Was Jenkins just a symptom of the larger disease within the department? Lisa entered Olivia's office, her expression tense. I just got off the phone with the tipster, she said. They're willing to go on record, but only if they can remain anonymous. That's a start, Olivia said. But we'll need more than that if we're going to expose this. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Olivia realized she was standing on the edge of something far bigger than she had initially thought. This wasn't just about Jenkins or even the precinct. It was about a system that had been allowed to operate without accountability for far too long. And now, with the truth on the verge of coming to light, the stakes had never been higher. The air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Judge Olivia Moore reviewed the latest documents on her desk. Today's hearing wasn't just about Jenkins or even the young boy's case. It had grown into something larger. The department's internal affairs team had launched an investigation after Olivia forwarded the anonymous tip, and the findings were damning. Multiple complaints, questionable dismissals, and evidence of systemic suppression all pointed to a rot that extended far beyond one officer. Jenkins sat in the back of the room, his face pale and hands clasped tightly together. He had agreed to testify voluntarily, knowing it was the only way to demonstrate his commitment to change. Despite his nerves, he was determined to face whatever came next. As the proceedings began, Lisa took her place beside Olivia, passing her notes as the first witness was called. It was the anonymous tipster, their voice altered and identity concealed for protection. The room grew silent as they recounted the buried reports and the pressure from higher-ups to sweep incidents under the rug. Each word landed like a blow, painting a picture of a culture where accountability was a rarity. Jenkins' heart sank as he listened. He had known there were problems in the department, but hearing it laid out so clearly made him realize just how deeply ingrained it was. And yet, part of him wondered if his testimony would even matter. Could one person really make a difference in a system this broken? When his name was called, Jenkins stood, the weight of the room pressing down on him as he approached the stand. Olivia's gaze was steady as she addressed him, her tone firm, but not unkind. Officer Jenkins, you've chosen to testify voluntarily today. Is that correct? She asked. Yes, Your Honor, Jenkins replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. Why? Olivia pressed. Why now? Jenkins hesitated, then took a deep breath. Because I've been part of the problem, he admitted, and I don't want to be anymore. I make mistakes, big ones. I need to take responsibility for them. But more than that, I want to help fix what's broken. The room was silent as Jenkins continued, recounting the incident with the teenager and the pressures he had felt to conform to the department's unspoken rules. His voice faltered at times, but he pushed through, determined to lay everything bare. When he finished, Olivia leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Officer Jenkins. You may step down." As he returned to his seat, Olivia turned her attention to the next witness, Captain Reynolds. The atmosphere shifted as Reynolds took the stand, his confidence apparent despite the mounting evidence against him. He denied any wrongdoing, his tone calm and measured as he claimed the allegations were unfounded. But just as the proceedings seemed to reach a standstill, Lisa approached Olivia with a note. Olivia read it, her eyes narrowing slightly before she addressed the court. "Your testimony has been noted, Captain Reynolds," she said. "However, new evidence has just come to light that requires immediate attention." The room buzzed with whispers as Olivia handed the note to the court clerk. A video was played on the monitors, showing a private meeting between Reynolds and another officer. In the footage, Reynolds explicitly instructed the officer to dismiss the teenager's complaint, stating that "we don't need the hassle." The courtroom erupted, the weight of the revelation sending shockwaves through the crowd. Reynolds' composure cracked as he stammered for an explanation, but it was too late. The evidence was undeniable. As the day ended, Olivia sat alone in her chambers, reflecting on the whirlwind of events. The system wasn't fixed, not by a long shot, but today had been a step in the right direction. Jenkins' testimony, though imperfect, had played a crucial role in bringing the truth to light. But just as she was preparing to leave, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Lisa, and it read, "Asterisk, you've uncovered something else. This goes higher than we thought. Asterisk." Olivia's heart sank as she read the words, the weight of the unresolved tension settling over her once more. The fight for justice wasn't over, not yet, and the road ahead promised to be even more challenging than what they had already faced.